Good evening. The Iranian regime, for years a defiant force on the global stage, now appears to be trembling, visibly fracturing before the eyes of the entire world. While many mainstream analyses attribute this to the relentless pressure of Western sanctions, the true, more insidious story unfolding tonight reveals a calculated, cold-blooded betrayal by its closest supposed allies. This isn't merely a collapse under external duress, it's a deliberate unraveling, a strategic abandonment reminiscent of historical moments when geopolitical partnerships proved to be ruthless transactional arrangements designed to benefit one at the expense of another. For years, Tehran had established a structure that challenged the world without begging for help. It skillfully used Western pressure to create chaos and stir up regional conflict, effectively strengthening the regime. The entire structure it called resistance was fueled by this very dynamic. However, the United States blockade of Iran has shaken the very basis of the regime's ideology and the pillars it relied upon. This time, the blockade targeted everything that kept the regime system alive. In desperation, Iranian Foreign Minister Iraqi secretly traveled to St. Petersburg this week to beg Russian President Vladimir Putin for help. He was carrying a long list with him, everything from air defense systems to fighter jets and even intelligence sharing. In short, everything needed for the regime's survival. But the salvation Tehran was betting on wasn't there. The regime faced a completely different reality. What it received were merely roundabout diplomatic phrases. Just our strategic partnership continues, and we are for peace. Promises that seemed meaningful but were actually empty. No troops were sent, no arms transfers were approved, and no economic lifeline was thrown. This passive stance was not a sign of weakness, but a perfectly designed, cold-blooded geostrategic trap. Russia was not only cutting off Iran's bridges through inaction, it was also fortifying its new bridges with Beijing by having China stab Iran in the back. At the heart of this double betrayal lies a very simple equation. The principle that what is most desired is always the greatest weakness applies here. And Putin knew both Tehran's and Beijing's desires and vulnerabilities. All he had to do was appear on the stage alongside Iran and do nothing. The cold mathematics at the heart of this mechanism is sufficient on its own to explain the rationale behind the betrayal. Just months ago, Brent crude was trading around the $40 band. With the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz, it spiraled out of control. The clogging of this main artery, which carries 1/5 of the world's oil supply, sent shockwaves through markets and pushed prices to the $120 threshold. The global panic served as a lifeline for Moscow. Having lost half of its production capacity, Moscow sold the limited remaining supply at exorbitant prices that had tripled, and thus found a way to finance its military operations in Kyiv while simultaneously subsidizing domestic discontent. This surge in oil prices, directly linked to the Strait of Hormuz closure, presents a stark deviation from historical energy crises. Unlike past events where global powers sought to stabilize markets, Moscow's calculated inaction here demonstrates a deliberate weaponization of energy volatility, prioritizing its own war economy over any supposed alliance commitments. The equation is brutally simple. If Moscow or Beijing had stepped in and given Iran what it wanted, the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz might have been lifted. Or Putin could have reached an agreement with former President Trump. They did this before regarding Ukraine. They could have done it again. They could have struck a profitable deal simply by giving Trump what he wanted. However, the equation of betrayal is a ruthless cost-benefit calculation. Such a scenario could have devastated Russia's war economy, already struggling under budget deficits from its foundations. This is why Moscow chose to watch Tehran drown in the blockade from afar, in great silence. Withholding help here was not a passive act. It was an active strategy that maximized profit margins. The concept of alliance was shattered on the sharp edge of interest calculations. The anatomy of the betrayal was not confined to the Kremlin's calculations alone. Simultaneously, an immense geoeconomic axis shift was underway in Beijing, because while Tehran was being sold out in Moscow, Beijing had already taken the buyer's seat. Beijing's silence in this crisis was no coincidence, because the absence of any concrete support from China for Iran and its appearance of remaining unbothered rested directly on Moscow's guarantee. When Hormuz closed, China faced a daily supply gap of 4 to 5 million barrels. Had Beijing been left to itself, this gap would have forced China to the negotiating table with the United States in global markets. But Putin was on the other end of the line. Russia maxed out the Espo pipeline, increased shipments from Pacific ports, and began pumping nearly 2.1 million barrels per day to China. High price, high volume by land, neither dependent on Hormuz nor within reach of the American blockade. Russia rose to the position of China's largest supplier. The structure, called the Eastern Axis, was being reshaped before everyone's eyes. As Iran was erased from the field, China and Russia deepened their mutual dependence and built a new energy monopoly between themselves. China's dependence on Russian oil is now above 20%. Beijing is prioritizing Power of Siberia 2 pipeline projects, increasing Northern Sea Route investments, and building a land energy corridor entirely independent of maritime risk. This rapid pivot by China to Russian oil, bypassing traditional maritime routes and deepening land-based energy corridors, signifies a profound recalibration of global energy security. It suggests a long-term strategic move to insulate Beijing from Western naval power projection, fundamentally altering the geopolitical leverage of maritime choke points in a way not seen since the Cold War. The implication is clear. Even when this crisis ends, Iran will not be able to return to the Chinese market on the old terms. Moscow took the seat Tehran left empty. The deals are long-term, the infrastructure investment permanent. Iran's erasure from the Eastern Axis is not a temporary loss. It is a permanent subtraction. And another striking detail of the betrayal scene is hidden in the chronology of evacuation operations. China had begun pulling its citizens and corporate personnel out of Iran, even before active hostilities erupted between the United States and Iran on the brink of war. After April 21st, a second and more extensive wave of evacuations was launched. In the same period, Russia accelerated the operation to withdraw its own engineers and specialists from the Bushehr nuclear plant, critical port facilities, and the strategic nodes of the energy sector. Those withdrawn were not ordinary citizens. They were specialists in fields that constitute Iran's strategic leverage: nuclear plants, port security, energy infrastructure, critical technical facilities, managers, engineers, and technicians. Every technical support line the regime would need to navigate out of the crisis was effectively locked together with the empty chairs left behind by these specialists. This is not a verdict that the regime will not survive. It is a reflection of what the practice on the ground is saying. One of the clearest messages a state can send to its ally is the decision to withdraw its own critical personnel. The fact that this message was delivered in the same period by both China and Russia, with what resembles coordinated timing, stands out as one of the most concrete indicators of the alliance's true nature. The logistical dimension of the betrayal manifests in another form along the Caspian Sea route. The Caspian Basin had long been positioned as a trade highway beyond Western surveillance, with off-the-books arms shipments between Iran and Russia routed across this enclosed body of water. This isolated illusion of security was shattered by unexpected blows. Israel's advanced strike capabilities targeted Iran's naval facilities at Bandar Anzali port. The shipyards sustained heavy damage. To the north, Ukrainian forces neutralized Caspian drilling platforms belonging to the Lucille Company. These operations from two separate directions shook the security of the region from its foundations. What is more striking, however, is that Moscow took no concrete step to protect this critical corridor. Tehran demanded urgent naval patrols from Moscow to secure the route. The shadow trade running through the Caspian was the artery of the IRGC's cash flow, the regime's long-term life support mechanism. Putin's Caspian fleet either lacked the equipment to deal with such asymmetric threats, or the collapse of the line happened to coincide once again with Moscow's silent approval. In terms of outcome, there is no practical difference between the two, because the closure of the Caspian route directly means the lockup of the IRGC's shadow fleet. Cargo ships are detained at ports, while electronic warfare components meant to arrive from Russia remain stuck in storage. This financial artery, critical to the regime, began to slowly freeze in the middle of the sea that bears its own name, and Moscow did not lift a finger to stop the freeze. Here we encounter another form of betrayal: deliberate indifference. Withholding help can become a tool just as effective as inflicting direct damage. When one looks at the picture on stage, Moscow's indifference too appears to be a move on the chessboard. All these realities on the ground are sending powerful waves into Iran's domestic dynamics. The breaking of logistical networks and the withdrawal of allies have opened deep fault lines within the Revolutionary Guard's command structure. The Shahed drones supplied to Russia for years, the munition support, and the joint factories established were all legitimized to the base with the promise that They will stand by us when we need them. But what is the physical consequence of this ruthless chess move on the ground? The scale of betrayal did not remain confined to political tables. It turned into absolute panic at the border gates and a total collapse in infrastructure. Let's look closely at the epicenter of this exodus. Let's start with Russia first. Iran's airspace is currently completely closed due to warplanes. In the maritime area, there is a United States naval blockade. There are only two safe routes left for foreigners to flee the country: the land borders of Turkey and Azerbaijan. The central hub of this exodus, and the point of greatest congestion, is the historic Ahra border gate on the Iran-Azerbaijan border. Under normal circumstances, this gate is the heart of the north-south transport corridor, a routine economic crossing point for commercial trucks and suitcase trade between the two countries. However, today Ahra has become the main evacuation corridor for the Allies. According to field reports by the Azerbaijan-based report agency and Euronews, between March 1st and 10th alone, 2,097 people from 69 different countries were rapidly evacuated through this gate. However, the demographic makeup of this number paints a much darker picture than a routine civilian evacuation. The vast majority of those leaving are infrastructure experts managing China's refinery and railway projects in Iran, senior engineers working in Russia's energy facilities, and Tajik and Pakistani diplomatic mission personnel. In other words, those crossing the border are not tourists, but the brain trust that controls Iran's digital and logistical switches. The situation is no different on the western axis, not just the northern axis. The Maghreb crossing, with its challenging geography on the Armenian border, and especially the Gerbilak and Kapkoy border gates opening to Turkey, are other critical pressure points of the evacuation wave. For Chinese and Russian officials, Turkey serves as the most stable international transit hub where they can fly to their own countries with confidence. This is the precursor shockwave of an impending massive destruction and total system collapse. We have a live report from a witness on the ground. I'm coming from Tehran, and there is a lot of chaos in the city. This network of relations, which the regime has tried to maintain for decades, with tales of strategic partnership, evaporated in seconds at the moment of crisis. The betrayal on the front lines is now impossible to hide. The so-called allies are preoccupied with throwing Tehran into the fire and protecting their own coffers and critical human resources. Russia's move is a cold-blooded betrayal that fundamentally undermines claims of long-term alliance and renders military doctrines invalid. For months, Iran supplied Moscow with thousands of Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, risking its own national security to feed the Russian war machine. But when the tables turned, Moscow's response was nothing but empty words echoing in diplomatic halls. Not a single concrete step was taken to protect the regime. Air defense systems to protect the skies were not activated. Militarily, they only shared inadequate and delayed intelligence. And now, at the most critical stage, economic and logistical betrayal is in play. According to a March 9th report by the Moscow Times, details reflected in statements by Rosatom CEO Alexei Lakov revealed the seriousness of the operation. As stated, 94 senior personnel were transported across the border on special flights, while 200 of the remaining 639 Russian citizens were transported in blacked-out buses during brief lulls when the likelihood of bombardment decreased. The specific details of this Russian evacuation, particularly the use of special flights for senior personnel and blacked-out buses for others, underscore a level of urgency and secrecy rarely seen in Allied operations. It suggests a pre-planned, high-priority extraction, indicating Moscow's foreknowledge of escalating risks and a clear decision to prioritize its human capital over its partner's stability. This evacuation operation, personally approved by Putin, does more than just save lives. It also led to the indefinite suspension of new nuclear reactor projects, which had been under construction since 2017 amid a major propaganda campaign. Russia seems to have abandoned its decades-long, multi-billion-dollar nuclear investment, deeming it unworthy of protection. On the other hand, China's move has made the situation much more complicated. The Chinese embassy immediately evacuated 791 critical personnel via Azerbaijan in the first stage, while similar emergency action plans were put in place for the thousands of experts left behind. On paper, the number of Chinese nationals in Iran is estimated to be between 5,000 and 9,000. This figure may sound like a small minority for such a huge population. However, this is a huge strategic mistake, because these Chinese nationals are the brain trust that manages Iran's lifelines. They are refinery technicians, operators managing deepwater ports, railway network signaling experts, and key managers of the famous Belt and Road projects. When this brain trust leaves the country, only piles of useless iron and concrete remain. The Iranian regime must face the reality that its allies have not only physically, but also systematically drained the country. The Russian withdrawal in particular deals a major blow to the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Nuclear energy is too complex and deadly an area to be managed by local technicians using trial and error methods. With the departure of Russian experts, periodic safety maintenance at the plant, digital calibration of cooling systems, and fuel rod management are now at great risk. Furthermore, construction of Units 2 and 3, which would have doubled the plant's capacity, has been abruptly halted. The withdrawal of Russian expertise has the potential to cause a massive drop of 10 to 15% in Iran's national energy production. The permanent plunging into darkness of industrial regions and large cities, already struggling with chronic power outages, is the strongest spark that will carry civil unrest onto the streets. The systemic collapse is not limited to nuclear reactors. The country's lifeblood logistics and trade networks also became dysfunctional overnight due to their dependence on foreign expertise. The international North-South transport corridor projects, which would connect Iran to Europe via Russia, suffered a severe blow. The departure of engineers from the Rasht-Astara railway line, which was being implemented with a $1.5 billion loan from Russia, left this grand vision rusting in the middle of the desert. In addition, the simultaneous withdrawal of both Russian logistics experts and Chinese operators working at the ports of Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and the strategic Chabahar triggered an operational heart attack in Iran's infrastructure within seconds, because everything at these deep water ports was in the hands of these foreign engineers. The moment the operators withdrew, the digital automation systems at the ports collapsed, and the massive loading cranes came to a standstill. The ports were instantly paralyzed. Oil tankers and cargo ships were stranded aimlessly in the open sea. Export figures plummeted to zero. Iran's economy, already struggling under international sanctions, is literally destroyed. Beyond all this economic and logistical devastation, there is a much darker chess dimension that concerns global geopolitical balances. For years, those hundreds of Russian and Chinese experts at the Bushehr plant and strategic ports served as an unofficial but the world's most powerful living air defense system for Iran. When the United States or Israel planned a possible operation against Iran, they hesitated to strike Russian or Chinese state officials at the targeted facilities, fearing the risk of directly dragging Moscow and Beijing into war. The emergency evacuation orders issued by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping shattered this invisible living shield in an instant. Now there are no foreigners left to protect at those facilities. This move has left Iran's most critical infrastructure completely exposed and defenseless against external airstrikes. At the beginning of the video, we mentioned that China immediately turned to Russian oil after abandoning Iran. Behind this picture lies the harshest and most ruthless example of geoeconomic cannibalism. Citing growing geopolitical tensions between Washington and Tehran and the need to ensure supply stability in its own domestic market, the Beijing administration reduced its oil purchases from Iran to 1.03 million barrels per day. This represents a sudden and massive cut of approximately 220,000 barrels per day. So, who did China, constantly hungry for energy to feed its massive industry, turn to in order to fill this gap? This is precisely where Russia, the other actor in the Great Betrayal, comes into play. China immediately shifted its course to Moscow, boosting its imports of Russian oil to a record level of 2.07 million barrels per day. This situation is a tremendous example of opportunism, showing how easily the concept of strategic alliance evaporates in the face of interests. The most critical detail is this. The Iranian government practically begged China, offering a massive discount of 16%, far beyond global market norms, in order to save its sinking ship and convert its oil into cash. However, Beijing has coldly turned its back on this offer. For China, Iranian oil is no longer a cheap advantage. Due to United States sanctions and military tensions in the region, it has become a risky burden to transport. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin's stance in the face of this situation is the pinnacle of geopolitical cunning. While Moscow continues its declarations of support for Tehran, behind the scenes it is rapidly incorporating Iran's lost market share into its own, using the extra oil it sells to China to plug the economic hole created by Western sanctions against itself. As the Iranian economy bleeds a little more with every barrel of oil it cannot sell and approaches collapse, Its ally Putin rubs his hands together, filling his war chest. Allies quietly fleeing, massive ports lying idle, and the lifeblood of oil unable to be sold. All these are pieces of the fiasco in the outside world. So what is the counterpart of this massive isolation and economic wreckage in Iran's internal dynamics? The picture is a dead-end street, completely black for the regime. The Iranian people have long been struggling with a destructive spiral of hyperinflation, a devalued currency, and heavy international sanctions. With the average civil servant or worker's monthly income reduced to $200 to $300, even filling a regular family shopping basket has become a miracle. The unstoppable rise in food prices and the fuel shortages that potential logistical bottlenecks will bring are raising tensions on the streets a little more every day. However, what really makes decision-makers sweat is not the unhappiness of ordinary citizens. The situation facing the armed forces, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Basij militia, which control the streets and are the sole pillar holding the regime together, is a real nightmare. When the vital cash flow from China is cut off and oil revenues plummet, the regime will be unable to pay the salaries of this massive military apparatus. History has repeatedly shown that no matter how strong the ideology, a military structure that is not fed and cannot provide for its families can very quickly lose its loyalty. The regime should fear the risk of a civil war or uprising created by armed groups grumbling because they are not being paid, rather than enemy aircraft from outside. The panic lies precisely here, in the possibility of the monopoly on power being broken. The Tehran administration, which for years believed it had built an invincible block against the West, received the real blow from the capitals it relied on, Moscow and Beijing. The dream of a so-called multipolar world ended devastatingly in the suitcases of engineers fleeing through the Ara border gate. As Iran's nuclear facilities fell silent and its ports were left to rust, the regime's capacity to survive completely collapsed. Today, Iran is being undermined from within, not by its enemies' missiles, but by the cold-blooded and calculated betrayal of its allies. The myth that nothing will happen to us is gone. No one is safe in that region anymore, and all bridges for return have been burned. The fairy tale of stability is over. The great unraveling has officially begun. The next 6 weeks carry the nature of a harbinger, a change that will redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East.